So my title comes across as slightly critical in terms of how we have been developing restorative justice, and I'll explain what I mean by MacDonaldisation. And apologies for those who like McDonald's. I don't. One of the things that I'm very passionate about is nutrition. And I'm sure you being Italians, like me being Greek, we like healthy food, our olive oil, and not so much bad food. But you can imagine by saying McDonaldisation, what I mean is this massive rollout of restorative justice in the form of like the sausage machine of the criminal justice system that just produces and reproduces things without paying attention to the individualities and our circumstances that I think are very important for restorative justice processes and the restorative justice principles. But I'll get to that in a minute. So yeah, starting with restorative justice, obviously now it's been around 30 to 40 years that we've been talking a lot more intensely about restorative justice. I provided a link of a paper I wrote some time ago. It's open access, so you can download it. Right, so just going back to the history of restorative justice, I think, you know, most papers and arguments have been that restorative justice is a recent concept that, you know, we brought it up, but like in the last 20 years. Actually, the evidence, the historical evidence and the papers that we have from philosophers and theories that have been developed goes as back as, you know, the ancient Greek civilizations and the Latin development of law and theory. In fact, the first person who I claim called restorative justice was Aristotle. So it goes as back as, you know, the Greek philosophy, but some people are even further than that, and they have found documents where the first human civilizations were dealing with conflict through restorative justice. May have not called it restorative justice, but it was the methods and the values of restorative justice. So yeah, obviously then that carried on, and with the creation of the kingdoms and the top-down structures of the criminal justice system, restorative justice started to disappear, and the conflict was taken away from the parties. And the state took over, the king took over, and a more structured way, or top-down structured way, was being delivered as part of the criminal justice system that started to appear after the Middle Ages. But in the 1970s, we started talking about restorative justice again. Surprise, because, you know, the system was just not working as it should be. So I would say the good news is that 30 years later, I think restorative justice is now being discussed, not just in policy. You have your own center. We are talking about university courses, degrees. You know, there's a lot more interest in restorative justice. So I consider that to be good news. Whilst at the same time, and that's the second point on my kind of good news slide, the international community, especially in Europe, law and policy has acknowledged the presence of restorative justice by adding it to some key pieces of legislation. So the directive, the Victims Directive, as it's called, and I'm sure they'll be covered in a minute, mentions restorative justice by name, which is an important development, though, you know, some people criticize that it is not enough. I think mentioning restorative justice in a higher law, such as a directive, is an important acknowledgement of its existence. I think we tend to forget that restorative justice is just, you know, is on the back of the criminal justice system. So I consider that to be a huge positive development. The same with the acknowledgement from the Council of Europe and recommending member states to, oh, thanks for writing that, recommending for member states of the Council of Europe to implement restorative justice in criminal matters. And the same goes for the United Nations. The United Nations spoke about restorative justice. They issued recommendations, but also a handbook, which I think is quite important to understand, you know, principles around restorative justice. And the 2020 handbook is the next slide that I'm covering. is a good indication that restorative justice is being put on the map. So just moving on from this good news to kind of what I call the restorative justice global social movement. And I think because people started to see the effects of restorative justice and wanting to see even more, we started talking about restorative justice creating, more than just changes within the justice system, whether that's the criminal justice system or the youth justice system, but using restorative justice and especially its values for social change and for social justice. And people are coming together to create a narrative and arguments to governments and international bodies for changes that they want to see to create better justice systems, but also better social justice, which goes outside of just penalizing people for crimes and antisocial behavior. So issues like using restorative justice approaches in education, in addressing poverty, in changing behavior, in addressing power abuses, whether these are by states or organizations or individuals. So as part of that, and as you might be aware, the institute that I set up called Restorative Justice for All, trying to do exactly what it says on the tin, offer and make restorative justice available to all. We wanted to push this social movement initiative, so we created a number of projects, a number of initiatives that are open to everybody, and I encourage students and anyone who's watching this series of lectures to sign up. It's the pledge, or the Restorative Justice Pledge, that we ask people to consider. And this creates a group of people who sign up to this pledge and a connection between them. And it's just literally on the back of basic human rights values that we ask people to use, which I think provide enough narrative for a joint narrative that we all sign up to articulate certain values behind restorative justice. So by acknowledging that, for example, when we engage in communication, we're not going to engage in violent communication. We're going to follow the peace principles and the human rights principles. These sort of acknowledgements and pledges kind of connect this group. So have a look at that. It's on the link on the presentation and also on our website. It's called the International Restorative Justice Pledge. The same goes for an initiative that we're trying to introduce for the Fellowship of International Fellowship of Restorative Justice. So people who practice in the world or restorative justice, want to connect them, offer them opportunities. Again, all this is on our website, so you can check out what's going on. Other good news is that probably you've gathered restorative justice in the literature. It has grown so much. I think I've found more articles on restorative justice than any other criminology topic, to be honest, which is great. So it's good to have good literature, and obviously within that literature, not just theories, but some good research and evaluation of restorative justice practice. So this is kind of a summary of achievements over the last few years and some, wins that I think are important for the development of restorative justice. So it's good to acknowledge all of those things. So one of my concerns has been around the definitions of restorative justice and the difference between principles and standards. And I've always advocated for safe and high quality restorative justice. And I think this is where we need to unpack the difference between having acceptable international standards that anyone who is practicing or even talking about restorative justice, they should respect. And then the difference between that and standardizing restorative justice. And having good standards is one thing, and using documents that are widely acknowledged to refer to those standards. And I mentioned some of them by the United Nations, by the Council of Europe, by the European Commission. These are documents that have been created with consensus, with research, with approval by different bodies, including the European Parliament or the Council of Europe. They're not documents that are created on the back of somebody's laptop or Google search. And these are documents that can guide us in terms of what are the minimum standards that we should be practicing restorative justice. Because unlike the criminal justice system and the laws that regulate the criminal justice system, whether it's the penal code or the laws in different countries, there is no regulation for restorative justice in terms of how it's been delivered. So having those standards is very important for the safety of the parties and for reaching the right outcomes and for following the right procedures. Now, that is very different from standardizing restorative justice. And what does it mean to standardize restorative justice? Is to just present a model or follow a model that is like a standard model that you have to follow. And I'm not sure who could create this model or claim that they have that model. Because restorative justice, in my view, and that's why it was important for me to mention the history of restorative justice, it's a concept, it's a living concept that is owned by communities and by the parties. And that should be the flexibility and the nature of restorative justice to allow it to respond to those flexibilities and the needs of each party and of each case. Now, as we know, there are different practices of restorative justice, whether it's mediation or conferencing or circles or panels, and the literature has expanded on those different models. But the important thing to remember, and this is so important for the success of restorative justice and this legitimacy, is to allow its flexibility and innovation to happen as by case basis, and not to present parties with one standardized model because that's the model that we want to promote or the promote that we want to sell. So that's the first concern that I have in terms of how we move forward and how we strengthen restorative justice so that it doesn't lose its innovative and different nature. Obviously, attached to standardizing restorative justice, my concern has been, and I put a Latin quote there, of who guards the guardians. Quis custodiet ipsos custodes. So if you are creating those models, those standards, those standardizations of restorative justice, and you're saying, I'm the one who created it, and this is the best model, this is the best standard, who's going to guard you? Who's going to check that you're doing actually what you should be doing? And that creates anxiety within the movement, I think, and those who have seen really bad restorative justice being done and being claimed that should be the standard, that should be the best version of restorative justice. So that worries me because it kind of shows, moving on to the next point, about ownership of restorative justice. And I don't believe that anyone should own restorative justice. Restorative justice should be owned by the parties and by the communities. So that is directly related to standardization to the title of this presentation, which is the MacDonaldisation of restorative justice. And I have seen this working really badly, especially in countries like the UK, where restorative justice was tried to be rolled out in a kind of massive scale. So after the introduction of restorative justice into legislation, at some point the government tried to introduce restorative justice through the justice system and try to fund certain organizations to do that. And through that attempt, they tried to sell courses or do a very quick training of over 3 days, and kind of claimed that prison staff, probation staff, and so on, police officers had the ability to do restorative justice with a 3 days training. And that also obviously backfired. This was some time ago, and there is now good evidence that actually that initiative led nowhere. And in fact, it led to cases where there were some negative results. And in fact, it backfired for restorative justice because it created even more concerns from movements like women's rights movements, those who support victims of domestic violence and sexual abuse and of complex cases. And the point to take away from this learning is that you cannot, MacDonaldize restorative justice in a kind of massive scale without considering how specific restorative justice is in its approach. And the second concern that I have in relation to this development is how easy certain organizations or certain governments use restorative justice as a business and try to make money out of it. And that worries me because it sells product in a way that it shouldn't be done. We shouldn't be selling short courses for the sake of training a prison to do restorative justice and then moving on. Restorative justice learning and education should be treated seriously and with respect of the values and the nature of restorative justice. I was trained as a lawyer. I'm a barrister in criminal law. It took me 10 years to get my license and practice. And I don't think there's any difference, especially if you divert a case from the criminal justice system and deal with it as a restorative justice practitioner, that a 3 days training should replace somebody's knowledge as a criminal law barrister or whatever education they had to undertake to be able to safely say to the parties, whether they are the victim's lawyer or the offender's lawyer, that I would take care of your case. I think there should be responsibility from the movement and the practice to say, am I really qualified to take this case? Am I really qualified to say to these parties, to the victim, to the offender, that I will facilitate this case and take it away from the criminal justice system? And I don't think we're there yet as a movement. We will more focus on making money than taking care of restorative justice quality. So how do we move forward? And I'm going back to the point that I made before about International Restorative Justice Week, just using that as an opportunity for awareness raising. And I've suggested a couple of things that we can do, how to get things right. And I think we should start with our language. And there's a lot of stuff about this, but I think it's very important, especially for your students, to differentiate between restorative justice and restorative justice practice. Restorative justice is one thing, and the word justice is in this term, and then restorative justice practice is very different. And let me just give you one huge difference between the two. The restorative justice, it's far beyond the criminal justice system. It is an ethos, is a way of approaching conflict that we can do on a daily basis, that we do on a daily basis in our jobs, in our families, in our communities. It's a way of living, it's education, it's what we do in schools, it's what we do with peer mediators. It's just something that we use to inform how we behave. And that's one thing. Restorative justice practice is, I think, what we should be narrowing down for regulation and for a very careful approach, because it involves taking away the traditional management of harm and of antisocial behavior and of crime and dealing with it in the restorative justice way. And that is very different, because it does divert the case. It does take a case away from the justice system to deal with it with what I call the restorative justice system. And that practice has to be monitored, has to follow certain standards. And by differentiating the two, because there's been a lot of confusion, how do we go about doing that? I said by going back to basics. We need to remember why we brought restorative justice onto the agenda again back in the 70s and the 80s. And I remember Niels Christie, who wrote, in the 70s about this. He said, "Return conflict as property to the parties." And I think if we follow those principles that we have all agreed to, then I don't think that's a hard thing to do. The hard thing is to learn to let go. The hard thing is to learn to share power, because unlike the criminal justice system, where the courts, the judge have the power, the state has the power. When we practice restorative justice, so I use the word practice, restorative justice practice, then as practitioners, we've got to be able to let go the power that we're given and allow the parties, when they engage in the restorative justice process, to have that power. And that is why when restorative justice goes well, one thing that we keep having as a positive outcome is parties' empowerment. And that's an important aspect and value to always offer and always pursue when we're practicing restorative justice. If we start from that premise, then consequently, the results will be positive. But that is the hard thing to do as practitioners and as educators, is to learn to let go and share the power with other people. Now moving on to kind of the what if. I like to set what if scenarios and think big, think positive, and I think this is also important for young people to have a positive outlook and just ask what if and dream. So I put a few things that probably we can work together on in the kind of what if scenario, and I've touched on all of those while I was speaking. So what if we all came together and the World Restorative Justice Movement united under one roof? Can we do more of those lectures and unite the continent? It is impressive how you managed to bring 5 continents through 2 lectures each. But we can do more about this, and we can unite. We can think less about promoting our organizations and promote the movement. That's my kind of what if. The second what if is, and especially you guys that are doing the new research on restorative justice, and you want to see more of restorative justice. But what if we stop trying to defend restorative justice? Because we always feel like we need to present its superiority against the criminal justice system and say, oh, do you know, the criminal justice system is bad, prisons are full, we need to promote restorative justice. What if we stop that narrative and we felt, well, actually, restorative justice doesn't need defending? And we focus more on being critical about restorative justice and developing its theories and its practices? What if our energy was directed more towards that, as opposed to comparing with the criminal justice system, defending restorative justice all the time? Let's just focus more on what we need to develop theoretically and practically. Let's develop more the theory, the philosophy behind restorative justice. So that's the second what if. The third what if, which connects to this, is, can we really learn to coexist with criminal justice? You know, we always present that restorative justice is in opposition. So you either have the criminal justice system or the restorative justice option. I think both can coexist. You can have both. And one can exist in the community, the other one can exist in the criminal justice system, in the justice space. So what if we learn to coexist? I mean, if restorative justice is all about consensus and about dialogue, why don't we push more for coexistence? Why do we have to continue this abolitionist approach, which started the debate on restorative justice in the 70s and the 80s? But as John Braithwaite said, we are now mature enough to move away from this extreme narrative, this extreme discussions, and it's now time to talk about coexistence. So that's my third what if. My fourth what if, which also connects with the theme that we have chosen for this year's Restorative Justice Week, is education. So what if we regulated restorative justice education as opposed to regulating restorative justice? And that is a big difference, because going back to the point that I made before about education and 3 days training, if there is no regulation of how we deliver education for restorative justice and teach new students, new practitioners on how to speak, teach, or practice restorative justice, and there is no regulation around it, I think the standards and dropping the standards will continue and the bad quality will continue. But that doesn't mean that we should be regulating restorative justice in the form of, if you're not on a register, you can't practice restorative justice. Let's not forget that restorative justice has been practiced by communities for thousands of years without regulators, without registers. And there's a quote in one of Braithwaite's papers about this regulation, and it says, try and say to an elder in Australia that they should be, their name should appear on a register to practice restorative justice. They'll laugh. You know, there's no valid argument for that. So that's the fourth what if. If you stop thinking about registers and regulating the practice and focus more on regulating the restorative justice education, I think that would address a lot of the issues and a lot of the concerns that have been expressed around bad practice, and focus more on the educational side as opposed on the regulating of the concept and who does what. And finally, you know, what if we, as I said before, if we structured every single intervention that we do through a co-design process with our parties, with the victims and the offenders? Is this possible? Can practitioners do that and let go? And how different that would be. So wrapping up, because, you know, I'm now running out of time, just, you know, on the point of regulation of restorative justice education, let's focus more on returning conflict as property, as Niltus said, to the parties, as opposed to returning restorative justice as property to organizations. Is not our property, is the property of the parties, of those who have harmed and those who are harming. And let's try and be more truthful and self-critical, learn how to share the power while we are practicing or teaching restorative justice, and allow our trainings and our educational projects to be regulated so that they are quality checked. Let's stop being defensive of our models, of our trainings, of our businesses, and let's just think more broadly and in a more ambitious way about how we push the restorative justice movement towards a more constructive and holistic way of dealing with harm. There is a slide where we have a call for partners to help us deliver the diploma that we just started on restorative justice practice, which is regulated and is offered to anyone who has an interest to take, you know, kind of more serious approach to educating themselves on restorative justice. And as I said, there's different initiatives that we have there for free for people to join, to increase their research skills, their trainings, and just generally connect with other people. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to getting your questions.
I see there is one question from someone who is online. I can see your name, but Sofia Maria, please, I give you the floor.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I have a question regarding the MacDonaldisation of restorative justice. So my question is it true that restorative justice can help to reduce recidivism, or is just a way to MacDonaldize the restorative justice? And in fact, as you said before, a thing is restorative justice, another thing is the restorative justice practices. So I'm very curious to know, what do you think about this topic? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sophia. And I think it's a very important question, especially because governments, they want to reduce prison population. They want to say, you know, I'm the right government that brought the numbers of offenders down. So reoffending and recidivism is definitely like the big thing to sell restorative justice and say, you know, the criminal justice system is failing. 75% of people go back to prison. But restorative justice doesn't do that because it does something better. You know, it reduces recidivism. Well, I'll use a silly analogy. You can say that all shampoos will straighten your hair, which is wrong. But some shampoos will straighten your hair, right? If you buy the right shampoo. What do I mean by that? Well, there's one thing dealing with restorative justice and a hate crime case or a domestic violence case, and is another using restorative justice for shoplifting, okay? So if you look at each crime and each harm differently, and where restorative justice was used for that particular harm, then you would get a lot more accurate information around the rates of reducing offending, okay? And surprise, surprise, because people think, oh, let's just do restorative justice with young people. Let's just do restorative justice with minor crimes, because that's what we should be doing. It's the easy way to do. Well, actually, the research that exists out there on an evaluations of actual practices, it says that the more complex the case is, the more successful recidivism and victim satisfaction will be. So in fact, as Grazia said, for example, domestic violence, sexual abuse, and gender-based violence is considered to be a no-go for some organizations and gender movement. In fact, it shows that domestic violence and complex crimes where power abuse is so prominent, in this case between a man and a woman, or hate crime between a white person and a black person, or whatever it is, when the emotions are a lot more intense, when there is a lot more at stake, apart from, you know, let's go shoplifting. I stole a bar of chocolate, ran away. Let's just do restorative justice. But how invested are you in giving what you need to give for the transformation that needs to happen during the restorative justice process to happen? Because restorative justice is all about accepting responsibility, going through a painful process of change, and after that process coming out, what I call catharsis in the Greek tragedy, come out clean. You have cleansed yourself and your emotions through that process. But how emotional are you going to be? How invested emotional are you going to be if the offense is not really significant for you? So the more significant the harm is, actually, the more chances are for recidivism and for victim satisfaction to take place for restorative justice. So in answering your question, you can't just say that all restorative justice practices will reduce recidivism, like you can't say for all shampoos, but you can say that for certain harms and when certain practices are done in a specific way, can reduce recidivism and can increase victim satisfaction. So that's why we need to be very specific and very careful with our claims, because big claims, as you said, can backfire.
Thank you so much. But sometimes I feel like when there is this topic, there is a kind of confusion between restorative practices and rehabilitation of offenders, because it's okay that there is this active responsibility. So in the counters, the offenders may be accountable for what they've done. But if after the encounters, the state doesn't do anything to reintegrate the offenders, perhaps there is this huge risk that these people will reoffender in the future. So perhaps there is this kind of differences, and it's two different scale between the restorative justice practices inside encounters and after, so during the rehabilitation. So since you say that also restorative justice is much more than just justice vaccinatus, I don't know if it's a quite good proposal, but we can think also about rehabilitation. I mean, between restorative justice and rehabilitation. So perhaps also there are sometimes so huge higher percentages about sex in reduced recidivism, because even if during the encounters there is this huge attention regarding the active responsibility, if the governments, the states don't pay attention to the rehabilitations of these people, since we know that restorative justice pay a huge attention in why the offender commit a crime, is the offender live in a, for instance, in a very poor state, in a very poor city. Even it's not that the offender was obliged to commit crime, and if the state doesn't pay attention to reintegrate the people, these people, of course, there is this huge risk that these people will reoffend. So perhaps we also have to pay attention to rehabilitation through the restorative justice values. I don't know what do you think about it?
Yeah, I'll answer very quickly because I see there's another question. And if you leave your email in the chat, I'll send you a paper I wrote about reconsidering the relationship between rehabilitation and restorative justice.
Oh, thank you. It would be very helpful for my thesis.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's a huge discussion because, and again, goes back to restorative justice practice will be within a limited period and within a framework, has beginning, middle, and an end. The restorative justice ethos requires you to have a holistic approach to the harm that we're trying to restore. And that holistic approach requires a continuum of beginning, middle, and an end. And that continuum doesn't stop or finishes with mediation. So that's why partnerships are very important with practitioners. So what are you going to do depending on the harm after the agreement has been reached? Let's say in domestic violence cases. If a children is involved, are children's services going to help? Are psychologists going to help? Are therapists going to help? Are social workers going to help? And this continuum of taking care holistically and more genuinely with the harm and what triggered the harm in the first place extends beyond the practice, which is why our partnerships with other sectors are very, very important to capture the holistic journey of rehabilitation. Okay, and that's why we need to rethink a little bit the relationship between rehabilitation and restorative justice. I'll send you the paper because it's obviously the beginning of a lot of conversations. It'll be interesting to see your thesis as well. Have a look at John Braithwaite's regulation. There's a book on regulating restorative justice and regulatory restorative justice, and that's a very useful a book around those topics.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm a colleague of Grazia in Como and Chiara in Varese. After your lesson, I am more and more convinced that restorative justice is for the person being the value, and in particular the value of restorative justice aren't abstracted through, but rather need that challenge the interiority of the person, of the holistic person, to discover that is true for the person himself. Thank you for your lesson, for your presentation.
No, it's a pleasure and nice to meet you. Yeah, it is so personalized, and that's why I mentioned Aristotle, because Aristotle make a difference between justice and equity. And equity refers to the justice as is experienced at the individual level. And this is what restorative justice tries to do, which is why it's very hard to MacDonaldize it. It's very hard to treat it through a criminal justice system that looks at people as sausages and produces a sausage machine that doesn't pay attention to those individualities. Without the offender, and I don't like using terms like offender or victims, without the harmed and harming parties, the harming party acknowledging responsibility before they enter and say, I did something bad. I need to fix what I did, and acknowledge that. And then while they are entering, have an open mind to address what they did by accepting that responsibility, and then allow a painful process to take place. tears, hugs, things that need to happen during the transformation. Like when I mentioned before the Greek tragedy, when you see Antigone and you feel that pain, and then, that pain then cleanses you. And when it finishes, you feel so cleansed, the catharsis that comes with it. Restorative justice is about that. It's about allowing that personalized experience to then allow you to transform and have those good rates that Sophia was talking about. And that's the personal approach of restorative justice.
Yes, Antigone, the right in the heart, not in the paper. Yes.
Yeah.